Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. I'm not sure where you are located right now, but I hope that you're experiencing some of this nice spring weather that we have coming our way. My name is Lesley Krempulec, and I am joined with my colleague, Sandra Carter. We're both practice consultants here at the College of Occupational Therapists of Ontario. We also have Julie Entwistle with us today, Deputy Registrar. And we also have David Pham from our communications team that's helping with the presentation. So thank you very much to those of you that submitted your questions in advance about the webinar. We have, I think our latest tally was 475 people or organizations that have registered for the webinar today. So thank you for the interest in the topic today. We have incorporated some of the questions that you sent in advance in the presentation, but we know that we won't necessarily get to all of them, and we are opening some time up at the end to field your questions, and Julie's going to help facilitate that portion. So if you have questions as you're going along, you can just put them in the question box. If we don't get to them during the presentation, what we'll do is summarize the common ones, and then we'll post that to our website along with the recorded version of this webinar. And as always, you can contact the practice resource, and that the contact information for Sandra and I is on the last slide of the presentation. So today we're going to start the presentation with briefly going over how the college updates documents. And then we're going to get right into things. We're going to start talking about the revised standards for assessment and then the revised discontinuing services document. And we'll leave about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for your practice questions. So with that said, I'm going to pass the presentation over to my colleague, Sandra.
Thanks, Lesley. Good afternoon, everyone. So on the next slide, for those of you who are not familiar with our website, we wanted to do a screenshot to let you know where you can access our standards or practice-related resources. And if you go to our website, there's a tab, Standards and Resources. If you click on that, you'll see a drop-down menu, and you can search for the standards or any practice resource either through the A to Z resource section or practice of standards. And this is just a quick snapshot of how we update our college practice documents. Of course, you'll see that we do an environmental scan, and we do have a practice subcommittee, and it's made up of OTs from across Ontario in various practice areas, various years of experience, and they provide valuable input into the development of our resources and also provide a current practice lens. All of our standards go through stakeholder consultation, and this is an opportunity for you as OTs to provide your comments. We do read all the responses and make revisions accordingly. And we also have access to the Citizens Advisory Group, and this is individuals or are individuals that are public members, and they provide the patient or client perspective and voice. And Lesley will actually talk how they were involved in the development of our discontinuing service documents. So you'll hear a little bit about that later. We also have our own internal processes. So of course the documents need to be reviewed by executive and council, and of course they undergo a rigorous editorial process prior to publication. So the standards for assessment. So happy to walk you through the high-level changes to this revised document. And as our mandate is in the public interest, of course, we want to ensure that OTs are aware of what the standards of practice are, and if there are any changes to the standards of practice, because they outline the behaviors and actions for OTs if they're going to be performing assessments. As most of you may have received, I think all of you received an e-blast in December that introduced the revised standards for assessments. Also through social media, those are other contact points. And of course, this webinar is an opportunity for us to engage with you, and as Lesley mentioned, an opportunity for you to ask any other clarifying questions. So the next slide, we'll get right into a bit of a deeper dive for the standards. So those of you who are familiar with the previous version of standards for occupational therapy assessments, you will have noticed that there has been a title change. And there was a lot of discussion about the title change. And really what ended up happening was we looked at all our other standards, and none of them have the word occupational therapy in them. So we don't say the standards for occupational therapy consent. We just say standards for consent. And so upon discussion with council and with practice subcommittee, it was decided that we would move forward with the title assessment, standards for assessments. We also have access to website analytics. And when we looked at that, we saw that when individuals were searching for this type of document, the keyword that was used was assessments. Also, another high-level change was, if you notice, the previous version had probably almost 2.5 pages of an introduction which defined assessment. Well, we streamlined that and we updated the definition. And the definition includes reference to informal and formal assessments and all the occupational performance areas that an OT may be assessing. There's also a reference to virtual and in-person, meaning that these standards apply to both, whether you're doing your assessment virtually or in person, our new normal. We also updated language and terminology. So we consulted with our academic stakeholders and we made some changes there. And an example of that is evidence-informed instead of evidence-based, best practice. Those sorts of editorial tweaks were made in this revised standards for assessments. So I hope everyone can see this. It was a bit of again, another snapshot of the overview of the standards. And you can see the previous standard from 2013, we organized it in stages, and beneath each stage there was sections, and there were 10 sections. So we amalgamated, we reduced redundancy, and we ended up with 6 overarching standard statements. And we'll go through some of those changes in the following slides. And the one last thing that we removed from this standard was the case studies or the case examples. And that will afford us an opportunity to update those examples to more current situations that are occurring in practice, especially around assessments. So you can look out for future resources pertaining to that. So let's go into the standards for assessments and what's really changed. So when we look at service initiation, that is, again, a new standard. And so I will read out the standards statement really quickly. And what this did was, it's an amalgamation of the scope of practice, competencies, and screening the referral from the previous standard. And the standard overarching statement is the occupational therapist will screen the referral and gather sufficient information to determine whether to proceed with the assessment. And we wanted to highlight a few performance indicators here. And following the screening, it outlines what the expectation is. If you are proceeding with the assessment, the expectation is to communicate your scope and time frame, or explain your role and responsibilities and clarify any additional information that you're getting. And then if you are not proceeding with the assessment, to provide a rationale or alternative services where available. So for example, if someone is outside of your competency, if the assessment is outside of your competency, or there's a criteria in your organization or practice setting, if you're not proceeding, to provide that explanation. And of course, all OTs will determine if it's safe to proceed. And again, we've included virtual. and in person here, because the expectation is it safe to proceed given the environment, if you're doing it virtually or in person, and managing any risk or barriers or mitigating those risks. Consent, we just updated. So as you know, we have the standards for consent. And of course, you know, this standard is aligned with that. We tweaked the language to make it clearer, but you know, it basically, there was not a lot of changes. So with assessment, this is a new assessment statement, a standard statement, and the statement reads: the occupational therapist will choose and apply safe assessment methods and tools that are client-centered, based in theory and evidence-informed to assess the client's occupational performance needs. And what this overarching statement includes from the previous standard, it includes the assessment approach, gathering information, and collecting data. On the assessment, I'd like to draw your attention to performance indicator 3.2. So, you know, the expectation is when you're reviewing or conducting a standardized assessment, when you review the properties, you have to look at the reliability and validity, if it's appropriate tool to use with your client or to assess your client. And one of the new sub-performance indicators that is noticed is have the necessary knowledge and skills to administer the assessment tool. And then moving on to analysis and recommendation, this replaces the statement of evaluation and clinical reasoning. So again, we amalgamated a lot of the performance indicators, removed redundancies, and the statement for this standard reads: the occupational therapist will ensure they have sufficient information to proceed with the analysis prior to formulating professional opinions and recommendations. And so the new performance indicators under this standard really are that the expectation is for OTs to identify any gaps in the assessments and determine if they need to gather additional information, ensuring that the assessment represents a fair, unbiased, objective, impartial assessment or evaluation of the client. And then here in performance indicator 4.8, it's left up to the OT to determine if a further evaluation is required, if after completing the assessment, additional information becomes available. And again, record keeping is another standard that we just tweaked some of the language. It is consistent with the standards for record keeping. And one of the changes I wanted to draw your attention to is that we've removed the expectation from the old standard to retain raw data. And so 5.4 speaks to this point, that any data that you've gathered that informs your clinical decisions or your recommendations or opinions, that cannot be summarized in the record. And we give an example, for example, a score form. You know, if you cannot summarize and that you need to keep that form because in its absence, your clinical decisions, recommendations, or opinions do not make sense, then you must retain it. And then there must be a note in the clinical record where that, for example, the score form will be kept. And we now know that with the advancement of technology, that a lot of forms can be uploaded to the electronic health record. And so if everything is in one place, that as long as when you're converting that data to an electronic format, that it maintains its integrity. Also, another expectation in the revised standards for assessment is to document the client participation or any limitations that are associated excuse me, with the assessment process. And finally, ensuring that before you finalize your documents or your assessment report, and apply your signature, ensuring that all the information is correct and it reflects your professional opinions or recommendations. And the final standard under the revised standards for assessment is disclosing information. And again, this replaces sharing information to the client and sharing information to other stakeholders. So again, we combine those two standard statements, and the statement reads, the occupational therapist will ensure that relevant assessment information is communicated to the client or substitute decision maker or relevant stakeholders in a clear and timely manner. And so a lot of that, the performance indicators remained similar. We tidied them up. The two new ones that we wanted to bring to you today is that communicating the assessment's results in a timely manner. And oftentimes, Lesley and I will get questions like, what from employers or from OTs, what does timely manner mean? And so we've given a notation, and that can be dependent on the status of the client, the referral process. It can be organizational policies or expectations from, third party or other stakeholders. And again, the other new performance indicator is making sure that your professional contact information is updated. We often receive calls from clients or individuals looking for OTs. They had questions about their OT assessment, and the information is incorrect or not updated on the public register. So what are some of the assessment pitfalls? We get lots of questions about that, especially if you're a client. And so here we put and compiled a list. So consent, that oftentimes at the onset of service, that the role, responsibilities, or what's entailed in the nature of the assessment is not clearly communicated to clients. Also, the risk and benefits of performing a task, for example, manual muscle testing, or if you're doing an activity or a simulated activity, just having the client understand that, if they are doing an activity, what information you're gleaning from that. Oftentimes, clients don't understand why an OT is redoing an assessment, especially if two OTs may be involved, that information is not utilized. So really explaining if redoing the assessment is due because it's required, a reassessment is required, or what is the purpose of you redoing that assessment. Of course, we all make errors. There are administrative errors, but to be mindful of, copy and paste when you're using templates, caution about predating or pre-signing, and what are the implications of that if the assessment may be delayed, and if someone else could potentially, is there any risk of someone changing the report without you knowing? And that's why in the standard for assessment, it says, ensuring that that it's complete before you sign your OT designation. Of course, there's all sorts of administrative errors, but just being mindful of the impact to a client who's requesting access to their assessment report and seeing other person's information there, or referred to the wrong area of the body or limb. And incomplete assessments, or, sorry about that, lack of clarity in reports. There's not a clear indication of what, after an assessment has been completed, the clinical reasoning to support your opinions or recommendations, or the heavy use of other professionals' reports. And finally, incomplete assessment, imbalance of objective versus subjective information, or missing details due to client factors. Let's say, for example, a trauma or cognition issues. Those aren't assessed or missed in the assessment, and the impact to overall function. So I will stop there, and I will pass it over to Lesley to discuss discontinuing service.
Thank you. Thank you. So sometimes I think of this document as a small but a mighty document. It's only a couple of pages in nature. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the overall changes from the 2014-2016 document to the one that came out in January 2021. So again, with this document as well, there is a title change, and you'll notice that we've removed the term guide in the title, and we're simply referring it to the topic of the resource. And that's something that you'll see on an ongoing basis from with regards to some college documents that were previously referred to as a guide or a guideline. The other thing that changed in the new discontinuing services document was the format. In the previous version, there was one main section and then some case studies. And what we've done in this new version is separated out and created some subheadings so it's easier to kind of follow through. And we've removed the case studies from the document, but don't worry, the case studies are still around. You can locate them in within the case studies tab of our website, and Sandra referred to that that page in a previous slide. And again, this just allows us to update and remain really current with case studies, but not have to go and adapt the full document. The other, and probably the most important change, is the content change. So in preparing for the changes to a content of a document, we, as Sandra said, we do an environmental scan, which includes looking at some of our data and asking OTs to provide input. So for this particular one, we also got the feedback of the Citizens Advisory Group. But when we looked at the practice data, there were 4 key theme areas that were providing some confusion for occupational therapists, and really provided an opportunity for us to give some of that clarity in this document and in the case studies as well. So, looking at these 4 themes, we kind of bucketed them into the first one, which is around allowable discharge. And occupational therapists want to know, in what circumstances is it okay to discharge a client? There was also some questions or concerns about the communication of this information, and OTs are looking for clarity on who is responsible for communicating about the discontinuation of services. Is that them? Is that members of their team? And we know that that can sometimes change. The other concern or area for clarification was around documentation and how to appropriately document the reason for the discharge. And I think this is especially important if there is some sensitivity around that reasoning. And lastly, it had to do with continuity of care. So OTs wondering what to do in circumstances where there may be no immediate or timely transfer of clinical care. And just as another point of interest, there has been several concerns or complaints to the college about occupational therapy practice around discontinuation. And these concerns are really around clients feeling abandoned by the occupational therapist, and have to do with circumstances where there was a breakdown in that therapeutic relationship. And we've addressed, in the new revisions of this document, we've addressed some of these points of clarification, as well as in the previous case studies and in upcoming case studies, where we can provide some really specific examples of these principles. And you can see one coming your way in the March edition of the newsletter that has to do with discontinuing services. So let's just get right into the document. The first subsection has a purpose, an introduction to the document here, and it clarifies that this document applies to both discontinuing services that are planned and also for those circumstances where it's unplanned. It also emphasizes the importance for occupational therapists to develop that mutual understanding and communication with clients. And to that point, we have in there a quote that says, preparing for the end of service really starts at the beginning, really starts at the first visit. So clients are very informed of what to expect. The next section is the client and caregiver perspective, and I would say it's the most obvious change to this document. And as Sandra had said, we did use a resource called the Citizens Advisory Group, and this is a group of clients and caregivers that have experienced occupational therapy services. And they shared with us that clients feel the end of services can often feel what they termed as abrupt and consider one-sided. And they really value a partnership model with their occupational therapist, where there's input and respect. And they like the idea of having open and transparent conversations about what some of their options and choices might be. And they really emphasize the importance of being included in conversations that talk about, how discharge happens or discontinuation happens, when it happens, and why services finish. And this is the third subsection of this document, and it talks about the rules for ending services, and these are set out in the Professional Misconduct Regulation in the Occupational Therapy Act. And it reads, when discontinuing needed professional services, an occupational therapist will consider the following, and OTs have to consider all four of these components: the reason for discontinuing, the condition of the client, and the availability and possibility for clients to arrange alternative services. So if we're looking at the first one there, the reasons for discontinuing, we looked at some of our data, we spoke to OTs, and we included a list here in this revised document of some of the reasons some of the more common reasons for discontinuing services. We know that there's many. We know that this is not an exhaustive list, but some of them would include the client's preference for ending services. Perhaps they are no longer benefiting from the services. Other examples include funding. The funding is no longer available, so it could be that there was, an approved number of visits to see the client, or they've reached their maximum in their length of stay, and that would require the ending of services. It could be that an OT is moving practices, or that they're closing their practice. They may be retiring. If there's any risk to the occupational therapist's personal safety, or if there's a boundary crossing, we understand, of course, that would be a reason for discontinuation. And we've included and expanded out a little bit more about this breakdown. So one other example of discontinuation would be if there's a breakdown in that trust or in that communication between the client and the therapist, despite reasonable efforts on the OT's part to work through these differences, that the relationship cannot be restored. So those are some of the reasons that services may end. If we are looking also at the second point here around the condition of the client, that there is a recognition that OTs have a greater responsibility to promote a smooth transition for clients that may be at risk for negative impacts due to services ending. And then the third and fourth section here really speak to the efforts that the OT is required to take to minimize any disruption to the client, and that a reasonable amount of time be given to clients to arrange for alternate services. I also wanted to point out with this one too, that it should be really clear who is responsible for communicating this information to the clients. In some circumstances, an OT may immediately be leaving their practice. It could be that there's health concerns and they're leaving right away, and in which case it could be, another team member or someone from leadership that might be sharing this information about a change in accountability or a change in provider. But there may be other circumstances, and perhaps you're ending your practice, and maybe you're doing psychotherapy. You've worked with clients for a longer period of time, and it would be expected that OTs are reflecting that and providing more amount of time for those types of clients. So it does really depend on the situation, but that OTs are being mindful of that. And that also, any change in accountability is also reflected in those clinical notes as well. And just to finish off this slide, there is a summary section at the end of this document. And I think one of the important parts of this summary is an acknowledgement that not only is the end of a service difficult for clients, but we also understand that deciding to end services with a client can also be very complex for the occupational therapist as well, especially if it's unplanned or unexpected. And again, this reminder to maintain professional attitudes and actions, even if things are difficult. So this is really a synthesis slide. And we received a couple of questions in preparation for this webinar. And one of the questions was, do you have an end of service checklist? And the other question was whether employer policies for practice override code of practices and policies. So in reality, occupational therapists have multiple accountabilities, and this slide goes through some of those multiple accountabilities. And one we know is to the client. Again, we're recommending that OTs have early discussions about how, when, and why services end with clients, that importance of maintaining professional attitudes and behaviors amidst difficulty with those therapeutic relationships when things become challenging. And again, in those circumstances where there's an unexpected end, is to make sure that you're identifying that subset of those clients that you work with that may be considered high risk, and really working through and giving additional support for options so that they can continue their care, and talking through them, problem solving about what to do in those situations if they have a change in status when they're not connected with you as the provider. There are also, of course, organizational obligations that occupational therapists have. Some of them may have to do with contractual understandings, but also we really want to emphasize about this communication and the expectation that there is there's an understanding with the OT and the client and the team members about the different roles and responsibilities. Perhaps there are processes that the organization has when clients are finishing services, and OTs need to be aware of what some of those processes are, but also clarifying how clients are informed that there may be a change in service provider, and what's included in that messaging or those conversations that other staff may be having with clients or leadership or OTs are having. So, clients have a good understanding of, who's going to be contacting them, the timeframes, and, just answering those maybe unanswered questions that clients may have. Of course, there are regulatory requirements, and that's why we are here today. So obviously we've gone through 2 documents today, but there are other documents that we expect registrants are aware of, especially when it comes to discontinuing. There are the standards of record keeping that also speak to some of the requirements, as well as the code of ethics that provides that those overarching principles for occupational therapists. And lastly, and this is kind of a catch-all, but any other kind of communication that's necessary to any other stakeholders that are involved. It could be third-party payers, it could be vendors, but making sure you're closing that loop with the client and other people that are involved in the clinical care. Well, that was a lot of information. We are going to go to the next slide now, and we did ask for questions that people can submit in advance, and we've selected some of the common questions to include here before we open up the dialogue for other questions that may be coming in. So the first question here is, can I discharge a client who does not return phone calls, who requires equipment follow-up? And we thank you for that question. It is one that comes up through the practice resource service as well. And we may not know why a client doesn't follow up with us. It could be that they choose not to, or it could be that they can't, they're not able to at this point. We do include, and you'll see in the document, the discontinuing document, we do have, one of the examples of discontinuing services is for clients that no longer want to receive the service. But we also think there's other important principles here to think about as well. And of course, it relies on your clinical judgment and your knowledge of that client. Is this a client that perhaps, was contemplating moving or is difficult to get in touch with generally? Or, maybe this is a client who is complex and maybe it's a geriatric client that lives alone and has multiple challenges and may have difficulty accessing services. So we rely on occupational therapists to be using that clinical judgment and to be taking whatever reasonable steps to contact that client to try to get in touch with them. But again, we acknowledge that OTs, we're doing the best we can and sometimes with limited information. So with that said, I'm going to turn the next question to Sandra.
Okay, thanks, Lesley. The next question is, can you comment on documentation standards for interprofessional assessments and joint discharge summaries? Great question. We get this question quite often, and the standards for record keeping also speak to this. But if you are doing interprofessional assessments or joint discharge summary, you need to just be sure that it's clear that what section of these assessment reports or notes that you are taking accountability for. And it also will depend on the practice setting and the processes that are in place at your organizations. But, if you need to respond, if you need to respond to this assessment or discharge summary, the section that you're responsible for, you can speak to it. In the absence of that, if you're just signing with everybody else at the bottom, does the note fall within your scope of practice, or will you be responsible for all the sections? And the answer is, if you're just signing at the bottom and it's not clear, yes, you may be. And also think of your clients who may be requesting access to the assessment reports or forms. Is it clear to them who they need to contact to if they have specific questions? So, great question.
Okay, the next question asks, what's the difference between an assessment and a screener? Again, a great question that got us thinking on this one as well. And it may be a question around semantics. I mean, people could be using the terms interchangeably, but they may inherently be different too. So, if an occupational therapist is doing a screener, is that really, is it a clinical screener, or is it more of an administrative one? Is it administrative in that, someone's just going and checking whether, the client meets, the age is within the age bracket, or that the physician referral has been received? Or is it more of a clinical screening kind of assessment that's being done where the occupational therapist is using their clinical judgment to make some decisions about services? So it really can depend. If it is a clinical screening and used more like an assessment, a triage, or an intake, then the standards of assessment would apply as well.
Great. Thanks, Lesley. And the final question that is here is it okay to use Q Global software, which for OT standardized virtual assessments, it may collect client information? And although this is not specific to the standards for assessment, we thought it was important to include this question because oftentimes in the practice resource service, we do get questions about, is it appropriate to use this platform software? And that's not a question that the college can approve or sanction. Privacy settings, all sorts of security mechanisms change all the time. But what we wanted to point out to you, and we have put this resource in the handout section of this webinar, is that the Information Privacy Commissioner has a great resource, and the title is Privacy and Security Considerations for Virtual Healthcare Visits. And so again, if you want to download it from or copy the link from the handout section, you can do that and take a look and review it. It's really helpful information. And so here we are heading into if there are any questions that during this webinar that you have, any burning questions. And so we'll turn it over to you, Julie. You can moderate that section.
Yeah, just looking through a couple of questions that came up in the question box. One was around the MOCA and the fact that the MOCA cannot be saved in a hospital-based sort of electronic measurement system. And any thoughts around that as raw data, I'm assuming is where the question came from, and how to capture that if the system won't facilitate it being scanned or saved.
Yeah, and that, as we talked about earlier in performance indicator 5.4, the question is, are you able to summarize the information that you're getting from that MOCA assessment? And, you know, documenting that that's what you've done. And or it's having those discussions with perhaps your records management if this is a form that you feel is of value and needs to be uploaded onto your system, to see if there's any resolution from that end, and then determining how to proceed. And if you absolutely feel that you need to keep that assessment score form, again, where will it be housed in a secure manner, and then noting in the clinical record that has occurred.
Anything to add to that, Lesley? No? Okay. Another question that came up was around the minimum expectation to document not taking a referral.
And again, you know, the standards for assessment and standards for record keeping do indicate that you as the OT need to determine what is appropriate to document. And so when we're talking about minimum expectations, what would it be like? What would it be important to note? These records live a very long time, and if you are ever asked to refer back to your notes, what would you need to document so that you can respond effectively, right? So there's no prescriptive, you know, do A, B, and C. It really is, as the OT, what is important and of value in this client situation to know.
I know sometimes, Sandra, we have the saying, everything's fine until it's not. So it is really taking into consideration what clinical decision making, you know, you was involved in that decision, and having that reflected in the client documentation. And it could be that you're referring to a set of criteria, or it could be that, you know, you're using other points of decisions as well.
Another question out of a hospital environment, and I think I'm understanding it correctly, but the question was around, do I need to chart if a client is referred but then discharged on the weekend? So I'm assuming that means that the OT did not have an opportunity to see or assess the client, and so, you know, they arrive back to work to find that the client is no longer a patient at the hospital.
Yeah, there would be, and I'm not sure if it would be the occupational therapist that's necessarily responsible, but there would be some kind of notation or reference to, you know, how that decision was made. So and I wonder even if the occupational therapist didn't have access to that clinical chart, if they weren't seeing the client, if that would be, you know, fall on someone else. But what we also expect is that that loop is closed, so that, you know, if you're ever having to go back and take a look, you know, would it be clear from that documentation, you know, what that clinical journey or clinical story would be. So there would be an expectation that there's some kind of explanation or description there.
Thank you. There's a bit of clarification provided to the screening question, and indicating that a screening is used to determine if you can complete the task being referred. given your skill set and the resources that are available. So it's sort of, it sounds like it's that administrative piece to determining if the referral can be accepted and moving forward. And just with that clarification, I don't know if it changes the response, but I just wanted to note that there was some additional information provided in the question box about that.
Was there a particular question around that, Julie?
It was on the question slide around screener versus assessment, and just saying that a screener is something that is used to sort of, looks like, determine if you're able to move forward with the assessment. So it's maybe speaking to the assessment standard with regards to that activity of screening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the point as well that some screenings are very simple and can be completed by others that are not occupational therapists, and some are done by occupational therapists that may be much more in depth. And so they may actually, if you're applying that clinical judgment and clinical lens to that, that the standards would apply.
Thank you. There's a nice detailed question regarding fetal alcohol syndrome, and I would just ask that individual to maybe reach out to us and email us directly. Sometimes these very specific questions are much easier to negotiate, navigate through a conversation and getting some more context. So thank you for that. I don't see anything else here in the question box, so I think we can move forward with letting everyone get on with their day. But we just want to remind you that our practice resource service is here to answer your questions. It is an anonymous service. If you have a clinical question, a practice question, Sandra and Lesley are here to help, as am I. I can tell you in the last few months, we had over 400 calls through the practice service or emails. So it's a high volume service, and we like to get back to everyone as quickly as we can. So please reach out if you do have a practice question that we can support you with. And we also would appreciate your feedback on this webinar. I know some people were mentioning some audio problems. I think that's just common in these virtual platforms, whether it's our end or your end, we're not sure, but hopefully you're able to get most of the content today and the slides were helpful. We will post this to be available to everybody. If you didn't get a chance to listen today, or if they want to have a refresher down the road. And please stay tuned to our newsletter and for any future webinars that we will be hosting. And lastly, I think the last slide is just about our social media accounts. If you're on social media and you want to connect with us, we do post information and that we receive from external sources through those channels. We don't bother everybody with the information we receive, so some of it just does get posted online. So if you're on any of these platforms, please connect with us to stay informed. So thank you everybody for listening today and for taking the time out of your lunch break, and we'll look forward to hopefully hearing from you soon. Thanks, Sandra and Lesley as well. Bye everyone.